Hello, and thank you for joining us today at the J. Ronald Terwilliger Center for Housing Policy. I'm Francis Torres, Senior Policy Analyst for Housing at the Bipartisan Policy Center. Today, we'll be addressing the topic of homelessness and its connection to issues of housing supply and affordability. For decades, homelessness has been a challenging policy issue across all levels of government, as well as a contentious political one. While some researchers, policymakers, and advocates focus on the structural determinants of homelessness and its relation to housing markets, others frame the issue primarily in terms of individual risk factors, such as substance abuse and mental health. Here at the Terwilliger Center, we're interested in understanding the interplay between homelessness and housing trends, particularly with regards to the supply of affordable housing. To that end, we recently published an explainer report on the drivers of homelessness, which you can access using the QR code that will flash on the screen periodically during the event, as well as in the link in the chat. In today's event, we will be hearing from a federal official, as well as members of the academic and think tank community who will share insights from recent research and policy proposals, discuss the root causes of homelessness, identify common sense solutions that can help inform effective policymaking and ensure widespread access to safe, stable, and affordable homes. So just to give a brief outline of our programming, first we'll have a short presentation by Marcy Thompson, Director of Policy Initiatives at the U.S. Interagency Council on Homelessness. She will present on the federal government's recently announced initiative, All In, the federal strategic plan to prevent and end homelessness. Then we'll have our panelists join us to share insights from their work and research. So to kick us off and help set the stage, we'll start with Marcy. Go ahead.
All right, thank you so much, Francis, and thank you to the Bipartisan Policy Center for having me here today to talk with you about the new federal strategic plan. We can go ahead and put the slides up, please. All right, next slide. If you have not previously heard of the U.S. Interagency Council on Homelessness, or USICH as we refer to it, we are the only federal agency with a sole mission focused on preventing and ending homelessness. USICH is charged with coordinating the council to catalyze the implementation of a federal strategic plan to prevent and end homelessness. The policy team here works closely with the White House and our council agencies to advance federal policies, programs, and priorities, while our national initiatives team works with communities across the country to provide technical assistance and guidance to state, local, and tribal leaders to achieve the goals of the federal strategic plan. Next slide. The council is comprised of 19 federal partner agencies, which are all shown here. Currently, the council is led by our chair, who is Secretary Dennis McDonough from the Department of Veterans Affairs, and our current vice chair is Secretary Xavier Becerra from the Department of Health and Human Services. Next slide. So let's talk a little bit about the scope. According to HUD, on any given night, more than 500,000 people sleep in shelters and unsheltered locations that are not meant for human habitation, such as cars and encampments. Over the course of a year, more than 1 million individuals and families experience homelessness, and many more experience housing instability, placing them at further risk or at risk for homelessness. The experience of homelessness is traumatic, with housing being a social determinant of health, and the lack of stable housing can result in a multitude of negative impacts on health, well-being, and life expectancy. Given the pervasiveness of homelessness, most Americans, often unknowingly, have friends, family, coworkers, or neighbors who are experiencing homelessness today, or who have experienced homelessness at some point in their lives. For this reason, homelessness has always been an issue that has received wide bipartisan support. Next slide, please. So the new federal strategic plan has been a long time coming. Beginning in the fall of 2021, the team here at USICH set out to ensure an inclusive, informed, and collaborative development process. All In represents the input of thousands of stakeholders whose wisdom and expertise are reflected in the plan's framing, strategies, and going forward implementation. And finally, All In represents a true federal plan with significant input and buy-in from all 19 of our member agencies. Next slide. So through all of this input, we of course heard a lot about the challenges as well as the opportunities that are ahead of us. First and foremost, we heard about the severe shortage of safe, affordable, and accessible housing and the wages and income that could not keep up with the rising cost of rent. We heard about the disproportionate impact of housing on affordability. And we also heard about the inadequate access to and availability of culturally appropriate supports and services, resulting in more people becoming homeless, making it harder for people to exit homelessness, and increasing the likelihood of people returning to homelessness. The growing incidence of unsheltered homelessness has increased its visibility, leading to harmful narratives and an alarming increase in laws and ordinances that criminalize homelessness. Next slide. And while these challenges will be hard to overcome, there are also a lot of opportunities that can be leveraged in our efforts to prevent and end homelessness. There has been an unprecedented level of investment through CARES Act and American Rescue Plan funds. There are still significant resources through the American Rescue Plan's state and local fiscal recovery funds, which can be used for a broad range of affordable housing production and preservation activities. We've continued to see a clear commitment from this administration, as demonstrated in the President's FY23 budget request, executive orders, the Housing Supply Action Plan, and other government-wide efforts to transform systems. We learned so much through our response to a global pandemic, such as the successful conversion of previously vacant hotels to non-congregate shelter and housing, the significant investment in housing choice vouchers, and the launch of emergency rental assistance, and the increased attention on racial equity and awareness of the way that homelessness disproportionately impacts some groups and populations, particularly people of color and especially Black people, creates an opportunity for greater transparency and accountability at all levels of government. Next slide. So all of this came to form All In, the federal strategic plan to prevent and end homelessness. All In represents the all of government approach that is needed to end homelessness once and for all. It is a multi-year plan that serves as a roadmap for federal action to ensure state and local communities have sufficient resources, policy guidance, and tools to build effective and sustainable systems that seek to both prevent and end homelessness. Next slide. Although this is a long-term plan that is intended to support and promote real systemic change that will lead to a nation in which no one has to experience the tragedy and indignity of homelessness, where everyone has a safe, stable, accessible, and affordable home, we must also act now and with urgency. For this reason, the Council voted last summer to include a bold and ambitious goal within the plan to reduce overall homelessness nationally by 25% by the year 2025. Achieving this ambitious national goal is the responsibility of all of us, government and public systems in partnership with the private sector and philanthropy, and we cannot rely on the homelessness response systems alone. We know that for some communities, this goal will be incredibly challenging, while other communities are already on their way to exceed it. Achieving this vision for the future means a pursuit towards housing justice through the transformation of systems and institutions that have historically left far too many people behind. Next slide. All In is built around 6 pillars. There are 3 foundational pillars: equity, evidence, and collaboration, and 3 solutions pillars: housing and supports, homelessness response, and prevention. Across these pillars are nearly 30 strategies with 180 actions that the federal government will pursue to facilitate increased access to housing, economic security, health, and stability. Next slide. So the foundation pillars are really focused on how we do the work of ending homelessness to ensure accountability, authenticity, inclusion, and evidence. The first of the foundation pillars is lead with equity. The impacts of systemic racism and discrimination have resulted in some groups, especially people of color, people with disabilities, and LGBTQ plus people, to be disproportionately impacted. Black Americans are especially overrepresented at a rate of 3 to 1 compared to the general population. Building an efficient and effective response to homelessness will require intentional action. The strategies and actions within this pillar focus on ensuring that federal efforts to prevent and end homelessness promote equity and inclusive and authentic collaboration for decision-making. We will prioritize the use of data and evidence to inform decision-making and policy development through taking steps to strengthen the federal government's capacity to collect, use, and share data, and by providing guidance and resources to state and local governments, tribes, native serving organizations, and nonprofits to allow them to do the same. We want to invest in innovation and build upon research and evidence of what works. The last of our foundational pillars is collaborating at all levels. Ending homelessness will take all of us, hence the name All In. It will take every level of government, public and private organizations, philanthropy, faith-based organizations, and more from all sectors. We must work outside of the silos that are often created in the pursuit of a shared and common goal. Next slide. The solution pillars are focused on the strategies and solutions needed to end homelessness, and these go hand in hand with the foundational pillars. The first of our solutions pillars is scaling housing and supports to meet demand. While we know that absolutely the fundamental solution to homelessness is housing, we know that people are often most successful when they also have access to voluntary and accessible supports when they need them, and which are based on their own preferences. A true housing first model requires that we scale up both housing and supports to create systems where all people, no matter how complex their needs are, can thrive. This pillar focuses on strategies and actions to increase the supply of housing, maximize the use of existing housing assistance, increase and strengthen system capacity to address the needs of people with disabilities, including mental health conditions and/or substance use disorders, and promoting practices grounded in evidence such as harm reduction. While we have done a lot to advance our homelessness response systems, particularly over the last decade or so, there is still a lot more that can be done to improve our overall effectiveness and improve outcomes to reduce lengths of time, the lengths of time in which people experiencing homelessness are in that situation before they're housed, and to reduce the occurrence of returns to homelessness. The last pillar is focused on preventing homelessness, and it's really important to be clear that for the purposes of this plan, when we talk about prevention, we're really talking about upstream universal prevention, focused on strategies and actions to strengthen access to housing, meaningful, sustainable employment, education, and other mainstream opportunities to reduce the likelihood of people having to experience homelessness in the first place. This pillar includes strategies that are focused on reducing housing instability for people, for example, who are exiting publicly funded institutions, such as foster care, as well as reducing housing instability for other key populations, such as service members who are transitioning from military service to civilian life. Next slide. Work to implement All In is already underway. For example, the White House announced a new place-based initiative that will be focused on unsheltered homelessness, and our federal partner HUD just released awards under their special notice of funding opportunity to address unsheltered homelessness and homelessness in rural communities. There are also new Title V regulations that will make the disposition of federal properties easier to navigate for affordable housing developers and enable the creation of new affordable housing developments to serve people experiencing homelessness. We formed planning groups that will be developing initial implementation work plans, which will define specific action steps, milestones, metrics, etc. And then from these work plans, we will have interagency working groups where we intend to partner with people who have lived experience of homelessness, as well as other national and local stakeholders. And we'll report on progress through our annual performance management plan, and we'll update the plan annually pursuant to our statute to reflect evolving metrics, input, and lessons learned. Next slide. As a starting point, USICH and our member agencies will focus on HUD system performance measures, Department of Education data on the number of children and youth experiencing homelessness during the school year, and other available data on racial disparities as a way to begin measuring progress. However, recognizing that much of this data is only reported annually, USICH and its member agencies will be working to identify additional metrics and benchmarks for measuring progress nationally and locally. Next slide. The work of preventing and ending homelessness really happens in community. And we hope that local and state stakeholders will use this plan to develop their own system level plans, establish their own local goals to reduce homelessness, educate their partners, and hold us within the federal government accountable. And then the last slide is just if you're, next slide, I'm sorry. If you're interested in reading the plan, you can go to usich.gov/FSP to read any of the sections within the plan and find additional resources as they become available. Thank you.
Just wanted to thank Marcy again. That was excellent context for our discussion, and introduce our panel for today. So on our panel today, we're lucky to have 3 experts and researchers on the topic of homelessness. First, Peggy Bailey, Vice President for Income and Housing Security at the Center on Budget and Policy Priorities. We also have Greg Colburn, Assistant Professor of Real Estate at the University of Washington's College of Built Environments and co-author of the recently published book, Homelessness is a Housing Problem. And lastly, Michael D. Tanner, a Senior Fellow at the Cato Institute. So thank all 3 of you for joining us. Before I get into questions, if you're watching live, please do submit any questions you have for our panel. At any time, you can post them in the chat if you're watching on YouTube, or tweet them at BPC_post them in the chat if you're watching on YouTube, or tweet them at BPC_bipartisan, or using the hashtag BPCLive. So thank you all for waiting as we handled our technical issues. I'll just dive in. First question is for the whole panel. To kick off the conversation, could each of you briefly comment on the findings and federal strategy proposed in the all-in plan that Marcy presented? And I'll start off with Peggy.
Thanks, Francis, and hello. It's great to be here today. First, I think it's important to highlight the prevention piece of what Marcy presented today. And the 2 pieces of that I want to hone in on are the need to preserve existing affordable housing and increasing access to rental assistance. Preserving the existing affordable housing doesn't get talked about enough when we talk about increasing supply. And as existing low-income housing tax credit properties, especially those that were among the first and over 30 years old, are reaching the end of their initial contracts. If we don't do more to preserve those units, create incentives so that owners keep those properties as affordable, and not just for another 30 years, but for a long term, we'll never close the gap between what affordable housing exists and our need for more affordable housing. The other piece in the prevention bucket is obviously increasing rental assistance. Right now, only 1 in 4 people who are eligible for federal rental assistance receive it. And we can see that the gap between rent costs and income keep increasing. We recently released some new data that I tweeted that shows that, especially in the last couple of years during the pandemic, rent costs, especially for those at the lowest income levels, increased well above the inflation rate, while salaries only modestly increased. And this was particularly true for Latinx and Black families. The last piece that I want to highlight from what Marcy presented is in the services bucket. we can't lose sight of the fact that we have to have a stronger community-based services network for all people, but particularly for people experiencing homelessness as we help them access permanent housing. Strategies like Housing First that give people access to housing and wrap the support services around them in that housing that are tailored to what that household or that person needs are critical. But that can't happen if the services network isn't strong enough to do it. And I'm particularly concerned about mental health and substance use treatment networks that have been depleted over the last few years. And with that, I'll pass it back to Francis.
Thanks so much, Becky. So I'll have Michael next.
Well, I think, there's some very good stuff in this outline, but there's also a little bit of a tendency towards one size fits all. And I think we need to be more willing to open it up to experiments, particularly at the state and local level, on a lot of issues. We should recognize that there are different types of homelessness, different types of people experiencing homelessness. There's the sort of visible homeless you see on the street a lot. Many of them are suffering from substance abuse problems or mental health problems. And they need to be handled in a very different way than people who are simply falling to the street because of a lack of affordable housing. I am gratified to see in the report an emphasis on the need to expand housing, but I think it's largely toothless at this point. Since most of the problems with expanding housing take place at the local level, there's limits to what the federal government can do on this. And I don't see the type of incentive structure in there to kind of put pressure on the localities to do that. At the same time, I want to express just a touch of skepticism towards Housing First, that we know that those states that have adopted Housing First, Utah, for example, California, the number of people experiencing homelessness has been rising despite the fact that they've adopted these policies. So we should be a little bit careful thinking that's a silver bullet, and that we should sort of just make every community in America adopt Housing First, and that's going to lead us to where we want to go.
Thanks, Michael. And then finish it off, Greg.
I thank you all for having me. I really appreciate it. Well, I was pleased to read this report. What I really liked about it was an appreciation for the complexity of this issue. I really appreciated that the report highlighted two structural drivers of this crisis, one being racism. A focus on racial equity is essential. The other is access to housing. And so I think those two structural factors were highlighted here. The other thing that I really, the other speakers didn't mention this, was the goal, the 25% reduction by 2025, if I remember correctly. And one of the things that concerns me when we think about homelessness is the general public's increasing skepticism about the public sector's ability to respond to this crisis. And so having a goal that's certainly ambitious, but potentially doable, would hopefully help the public recognize that a coordinated effort from federal, state, and local government in partnership with private sector actors and the nonprofit community can deliver results. And I think once we can demonstrate some success, I think that will increase the public support for these initiatives, which I think is essential.
Thanks so much, Greg. So as we heard from Marcy, the rising rent burden for low-income households is one of the biggest challenges in tackling homelessness. So staying with you, Greg, for a minute, your book on homelessness, Homelessness is a Housing Problem, emphasizes that higher rents and lower vacancy rates are among the strongest explanatory variables for why certain places seem to have a higher incidence of homelessness than others. Could you talk a little bit about this relationship and how policymakers should be thinking about it and addressing it?
Sure. The motivation for writing this book was really to answer the question why some communities in our country have such high levels of homelessness while others don't. And obviously, I live in Seattle, and we're right at the top end there. So we want to answer that question for concerned citizens, because I think it is essential for us to understand those relationships. Place really matters when we talk about homelessness. The context in which people live really matters. And when we actually looked at the data here, what we see is that places that have very expensive housing and where housing isn't very accessible have far higher rates of homelessness than other places. There are people with substance use disorders. There are people who are mentally ill, experiencing poverty in every jurisdiction in the country. But the context in which those risk factors occur really matters. And so the reason that Seattle has 5 times the per capita homelessness of Chicago is not that we have more people with certain conditions. It's the fact that we have a very, very hostile housing market, and life happens within that context and produces disproportionate rates of homelessness. And that was really to the purpose of the book, and to get away from focusing on individual vulnerability or individual failure and say that there are fundamental structural explanations for what we observe. If we can understand why certain places have lots of homelessness, that should tell us something about the root cause and the drivers of this problem.
Thanks so much, Greg. So staying on the topic of systemic versus individual characteristics, and also how cities and localities are thinking about this, I want to throw it to Peggy. So with many cities struggling to address the increase in unsheltered homelessness, we see policymakers sometimes struggling to strike the balance between addressing safety concerns that the public might have, as well as meeting the needs and, of course, respecting the civil rights of unhoused people. So I would love to get any thoughts or any comments on how to strike that balance and how to make sure that we're meeting the needs of unhoused communities as well as the public at large.
Sure. So I think setting up all of this is sort of a false dichotomy, that public safety concerns and civil rights concerns can and should actually coexist. And that the key thing for policymakers to keep in mind is that the solution, as Greg outlines, is housing and understanding that we're solving an income issue, and that through no fault of their own, people either through their job or through the benefit structure don't have enough money to meet many of their basic needs, and housing is one of them. And so we have to remember that homelessness itself is a public safety issue. For the people who are living without a home or without a place to call their own, they're at higher risk of violence, exposure to the elements, and generally too, their mental health stress is their mental health is stressed due to the trauma of living on the street and the constantly having to wonder where they're going to sleep at night and stay safe. And this is particularly true for women, transgender people, and people with existing mental health or substance use challenges who face particularly high rates of violence while they're unhoused. Often the feelings of being unsafe by the general public are more about bias or rooted in racism rather than what actually happens. And that's not to say that sometimes things don't happen, but it is to say that by and large, those feelings of safety are found. We have to examine those. And it's just really important to remember that to acknowledge our neighbors who are unhoused, say hello, and remember to treat others the way we would want to be treated, because many of us are at many people are one crisis away from being concerned about where they're going to live and at being at risk of housing instability. And so the number one thing that policymakers need to keep front in mind, and their North Star should be that affordable housing with the right wraparound services and supports is what will keep everyone safe. Having a safe place to call home instantly addresses all of these needs. And so instead of investing more in ways that mitigate homelessness, we need to invest in the things that solve homelessness. And that's what is critical to being able to advance strategies to end homelessness, and what is keeping us from ending homelessness. It's not, in my opinion, it's not a housing first strategies and the failure of housing first strategies that are keeping us from ending homelessness. It's a lack of investment in housing and the support services that make the strategies that we use successful.
Thank you so much. Okay, Michael, to bring you back in, you've written extensively about strategies to address homelessness by reforming land use regulations and zoning. How can governments help incentivize such reforms and make it easier and less costly to add to the supply of both market rate housing, but also subsidized units and units for homeless people or low-income households?
Yeah, the evidence is overwhelming that housing costs are a significant contributor to the rise in homelessness. I think that everyone sort of on the panel here is in agreement on that. And housing costs are rising in large part because we have a supply and demand disconnect. We just simply have more people needing housing than we're building housing, and we need to build more of it, especially denser housing, more multifamily housing in particular. That is largely blocked in many locales, particularly at the local level, by zoning ordinances and other regulations that simply prevent people from building in those areas, or building the type of housing that would lower costs in those areas. So we really need to be looking at this at all levels. We need to look at this at the local level, localities, local county supervisors, city councils, mayors need to be looking at their regulations, what they can do to relieve this. There shouldn't be sort of low-income areas where you can build multifamily housing, and then high-income areas where, you know, we don't want those folks living in our neighborhood, so we'll have extensive exclusionary zoning laws to keep them out. That needs to be addressed at the local level. States may have to preempt in many cases. If they're Dillon rule states, they can preempt the localities on that. We're seeing that happen in California now, and other areas where it's having an impact. And finally, the federal government can put incentives as well. The federal government should not be in a position where it's endlessly chasing its tail, watching rental costs rise while we provide heavier, more and more subsidies. That's not fair to taxpayers. It's a boondoggle for the landlords, and it's not helping people get into housing either. What the federal government should do is make the housing assistance contingent upon localities adjusting their zoning laws in order to be able to build more housing.
Thanks for that, Michael. So going back to Greg, as we know, the resources and political capital needed to achieve a lot of these policy changes in homelessness are finite. A lot of the things that Michael just brought up are oftentimes hard asks and difficult to achieve at the local and state level. Political energy is just not infinite. Could you offer some insights on the trade-off between focusing on short-term interventions, such as building greater shelter capacity, focusing on passing right to shelter laws, versus making it easier to build both a stock of permanent supportive housing and the supply of housing more broadly?
Yeah, thanks, Francis. That is one of the real big challenges that we have. And I whenever I speak to elected leaders on the West Coast, I acknowledge what a difficult job they have of balancing the short-term need and the long-term solutions to this problem. I will say that in your question, you speak about finite resources and political will or political capital. And I want to highlight the fact that finite is different than fixed. Right. And so I want to highlight here that this is not a fixed pot. We are paying, we spend a lot of money on responding to homelessness right now, but their untreated homelessness is an incredibly expensive investment that we're making. We just don't realize that. Those investments are coming in through the criminal justice system and public healthcare system, streets and sanitation, et cetera. And so by not acting, we are still making a huge investment, and it's a terribly inefficient process, and it exacts a huge human cost in terms of people on the streets. And so when we talk about the investments in housing and supportive services that are necessary, it's not from a point of zero, it's from a point that we're already spending a lot of money, and by making these investments, we would save money through other systems. Now that's complicated because of the fracture of our jurisdiction or government infrastructure, but we need to recognize that. And so, when we were writing the book, we talked to a lot of people about this short versus long-term tension. And the response we got back from everyone was, as Peggy said earlier, a little bit of a false dichotomy. We can't just do one or the other. And when people in Seattle and San Francisco say, well, look at New York, 97% of people are in shelter, we say, be careful what you wish for. That's a system that has cost tremendous billions and billions and billions of dollars. And we've warehoused people in very suboptimal living conditions for decades. And so while we need to attend to the short-term crisis of unsheltered chronic homelessness in West Coast cities, and shelter certainly will be a part of that, increased shelter capacity, we can't then assume then that the problem is solved. At the same time we're doing that, we need to talk about what Michael's talking about, which is making sure that we don't have massive amounts of single-family zoning in cities where we need it. We need denser housing, we need more affordable housing. And so those longer-term changes and investments can happen while we attend to the short-term crisis. Is that easy? No, it's not. A lot of good people have devoted their lives to this. I wouldn't suggest otherwise, but the scope of this challenge demands that we focus on both of those things.
I'll actually open it up to the broader panel and some of the questions we've been getting from the audience. Relatedly, actually, one of our audience members asks, we have plenty of vouchers around, but They are insufficient to cover the cost of rentals. Can voucher amounts be increased substantially to improve access? So Michael or Greg, if you have any comments on that.
Yeah, let me jump in on that. I think we need to be careful of that because you get yourself again into cycle where landlords simply are free to raise rents and we provide a bigger voucher. It's great for the landlord, but if you don't get the voucher, you fall further and further behind. So we should be careful about basing the vouchers on average or median rental costs because that's an invitation to raise those costs. We see the same thing that's gone on in healthcare. We see the same thing that's gone on in college education, that essentially the entities absorb the subsidy and then keep raising their prices anyway.
Peggy, I see you're back. So I'll open it up to you for both my original question, but also the audience question, if you want to ask.
Sure. I think so. On the original question, just taking a step back, we know that we did a lot of good work during the pandemic when it comes to emergency rental assistance. So I'll start there. In the pandemic relief packages at the federal level, there were over $46 billion dedicated to emergency rental assistance and eviction prevention. Those resources, some of which have been used up, but some of them are still out and available for people to access. Communities, it took a minute, but communities stood up new innovative strategies connected to the court system to be able to mitigate evictions, which was a win for both tenants and the landlords. Landlords ultimately want their unit to be occupied and want to get paid. Tenants want to be able to stay where they live and be able to pay their rent. The emergency assistance helped that and helped mitigate huge influxes of people experiencing homelessness. And I think we learned a lot from that about what can happen at the local level with the right investment to try to stave off evictions and treat evictions more like the services intervention rather than the punitive process that often happens, and that leads to the increased costs that Greg spoke about earlier. When it comes to thinking about vouchers, obviously, and rental assistance for people in the private market, there are obviously challenges with how to be able to do that. And I think we just need to be able to think big picture. There are cost controls already included within existing rental assistance. The federal government caps how much the voucher will pay for by calculating fair market rents. Right now, private rents are being taken into account more when that happens, but obviously in the short run, especially, that's what's needed in order to make sure that people can access housing in their communities. And so, just looking at some of the lessons we learned from the emergency rental assistance program and other resources during the pandemic, we should be able to provide some flexibilities to the future of rental assistance to make it easier for people to lease properties.
Thanks so much, Peggy. So I'm going to open it up to audience questions. We've already had one. If you're in the audience and you want to ask questions, you can go ahead and write your question in the YouTube chat or via our Twitter handle. So we've already gotten a few, and I'll open these up to whoever wants to answer. Here's one. Is it possible that the locations that have adopted housing first are seeing an increase in homelessness because people are going to those places to try to get what they need?
I would say that there's, I was going to say,
Yeah,
I see no indication of that at least in terms of California, for example. Surveys of the homeless population in California indicates that most of them are native Californians. Most of them are actually native to the city in which they are still residing. Very few of them are coming from other places to get benefits. It's largely that you simply have constant people falling into homelessness in California, which of course has the highest housing costs in the nation. So I think there's a relationship there.
Yeah, we talk about the mobility argument in our book, and there's ample evidence, as Michael suggested, that this is not a mobility story, that this problem is homegrown. I think as it relates to housing first, there are communities, Houston, Milwaukee, that have used this with great success and dramatically reduced their homeless population. And the New York Times wrote about this, and I got calls in Seattle and said, "Why aren't we using housing first here?" And I said, we are. But the fundamental shortage of housing in West Coast and East Coast communities undermines our ability to use that intervention effectively. Because ultimately you do need a unit in which to place someone if you want to use that housing first intervention. And so the very shortage of housing that causes more people to experience homelessness, it also makes it harder for people to get out. And so I think some of the causal arguments about housing first are a little bit misguided, because many times we're looking at places with very insufficient housing supply when we attack that intervention.
Thanks, Michael and Greg. So bringing up another interesting point, here's another question. It seems like there is no housing in some places at the bottom of the market. Could micro units or very small apartments with a shared bathroom be a solution for families at the edge of homelessness and housing insecurity?
So I'd like to start with that on that one. I think it's important when we're thinking about solutions to homelessness and housing instability largely, that we remember to think about where any of us would want to live, and creating housing that would appeal to everyone, right? And so thinking about this, a unit in New York City that might be, an efficiency unit that's normal housing that everyone else would want to, is one thing. But going to a smaller community in the Midwest, that isn't what people are used to and living in. And so it's important to have to think about that when we're creating housing, especially the way that I would think about it is people aren't, how often does anyone move? Right. And so we want to be able to create strategies around housing that integrate everyone into the same housing that any of the rest of us would want to live in. So that's the thing I think to keep front of mind. The other piece to think about too is what Jenny Schutz talks about in her book Fixer Upper, that there's only so low that rent can be, right, and still be able to maintain and operate that building. So when we think about supply, we often talk about vouchers as a demand side strategy, which it is, but there's also a supply component since we don't build public housing in the same way that we used to. So those are the two things that I think to keep in mind as we're addressing the supply issue for homelessness.
Thanks, Peg. So I can move on to the next question. What percentage are mental illness and drug addiction compared to strictly economy or housing? So we're assuming they mean what percentage of unhoused folks might be suffering from substance abuse or mental health issues versus not. And I wanted to ask this question not to have you say the specific number, but I think speak more broadly about that distinction that people tend to make. And if you have any insights to share about the incidence of these issues in the broader unhoused community versus what people might perceive. So if anyone wants to comment on that.
Well, numbers I've seen have generally indicated that it's somewhere between a half and a third of the unhoused homeless are people suffering from mental illness or substance abuse. If you look at, there was a study that came out in DC, showed about half the homeless have an attachment to the workforce. So you have to assume that by and large, those are folks that are suffering from a housing shortage rather than other problems. In California, as most of the officials told me, it was about a third substance abuse, mental health issues, and about 2/3 housing affordability issues, things like that. You also have to look at a little bit of a chicken and egg issue with the folks that are experiencing the substance abuse and mental health issues. If you fall to the street and you're living on the street, you often self-medicate by taking drugs of some kind, or you experience mental health issues that get worse because, frankly, living on the street's a lousy way to live, and people have to deal with it in various ways. So often people who don't have these problems or have these problems in minimal condition end up on the street, and then 6 months later, it's much worse that they have to deal with.
I agree with Michael. What I say to people is the majority of people experiencing homelessness are not addicted or mentally ill. And you also need to think about the subpopulations. Among the unsheltered chronic homeless population, you're going to see higher levels of addiction and mental health issues. And that causal arrow, as Michael mentioned, goes in both directions, right? And so just because you see someone on the street who's experiencing mental illness, that may or may not have been the cause of that bout of homelessness. It could be the consequence. And so, you know, as I say to people in Seattle, I wish I had this magic wand, but if I had a magic wand and could end all addiction tomorrow, we would still have a very large homeless population in our community because of the fundamental structural factors related to income and housing where we happen to live.
Yeah, and I agree wholeheartedly. And I think what I would bring it back to is I think what Michael mentioned at the beginning is the individual nature of all of this, right? And the need to really think about individual interventions for people rather than trying to bucket people into specific categories.
Excellent. Thank you all. So before we finish the panel, we have just a few minutes remaining. I wanted to ask if there's anything, any topic or any argument that hasn't been made yet that you think is important to comment on for our audience.
Yeah, let me just throw in one last idea here, which is that when we talk about affordable housing, we often focus strictly at housing at the low end of the income scale. I think it needs to be market rate housing. There's a filtration process that takes place in housing that you want people to move up the housing chain as their incomes get bigger and their families get bigger. You want them moving out of the house they're in now to open up that housing at the bottom end of the market for people to move into. You don't want to lock everybody into the level they're at now. So I think you need to build housing at all income levels, not just say it's only going to be at the lowest level as well. I think you need to have just more houses, period.
And just building on that, I think it's critically important. We have these artificial silos between homelessness and the housing community and rental market and single family market. And we need to think about housing more comprehensively for exactly the reasons that Michael mentions. We you know, if housing is the solution to homelessness, then I shouldn't participate in a homelessness advocacy coalition and a housing advocacy coalition. We have to come together. And also the you know, single family supply, especially as we think about affordable single family supply, that will help people at the upper income of the rental market move out and help also and be a cost control for the rest of the rental market. So we've really got to come together and break these artificial silos if we want to solve homelessness or any of the other affordable housing issues that we face.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more. The one thing I would add is when I give my public talks on this, people will challenge me and say, okay, fine, this data is interesting. I buy your argument that there's a relationship between housing and homelessness, but how do we know that housing is going to end homelessness? This person I just saw on the street, I'm not convinced that housing will really work for that person. Their needs are greater than that, for example. And the answer that I always get, and this goes back to Marcy and her colleagues in the federal government, is we cut veteran homelessness by 50% over a decade in the United States. And how did we do that? We gave people housing. And it took different forms. In some cases, it was a voucher. In some cases, it was a unit. In some cases, it was a unit with services for people who really needed it. And how did that happen? We had leaders from both political parties who said, we don't want veterans returning from Iraq and Afghanistan to experience homelessness. We don't want to repeat the mistakes of the Vietnam generation. We had political will and we applied resources and we cut homelessness by 25%. So the real question for me then becomes one of political will and resources. We've demonstrated that we can radically reduce the homeless population in the United States. Will we do that for a broader population of people? And that's the question.
All right. Thank you so much to our three panelists. This has been an excellent conversation. And this is all the time we have. So again, thank you for such an interesting and fruitful conversation. And apologies again for the technical difficulties. And thanks so much for our audience for sticking with us. Addressing the root causes of homelessness and achieving greater housing affordability are key focus areas for the Terwilliger Center here at BPC. We're really excited to keep working on this issue. And if this event was of interest to you, please do go to our website and check out our work. Thanks again to our presenter, our panelists, and everyone who joined us today, and take care.